Sir Francis Galton, History of Psychology, Professor Michael Botwin, California State University at Fresno. Hi, in this unit we're going to look at some of the early theorists that started to figure out what intelligence is as a theoretical concept. We're going to be talking about 4 or 5 individuals here very briefly. One of the unifying things, besides their interest in intelligence with these folks, is that they were also part of the founders of our field. And you see people, especially like Thurstone and Cattell, making major contributions to the professionalization of psychology by serving as presidents of the American Psychological Association, help founding important journals in our field, and things like that. So each one of these individuals has done voluminous work, but we're just going to briefly look at their contributions from a historical perspective. Enjoy. Francis Galton came from eminent individuals himself. He was the grandson of Ras Darwin, who we've talked about in our previous unit, as he was also Charles Darwin's grandfather, and comes from an eminent family. That's going to play into things we talk about a little bit later in terms of Galton stuff. I'm fascinated with Galton because historical psychologists have tried to guess his IQ. The textbook says 200. I've seen as high as 240. So he was this extremely intelligent man. He was also what you call a polymath. If you've never heard the term polymath, a polymath is an individual who can do just about anything. And Galton's interest and work were really all over the place. If you look at his early life, you can see he was destined to do something pretty big. He could read and write by age 2.5. He could read any English language book by 5. And he could read Shakespeare for fun by 7 years old. I try to remember what I was doing at 7 years old, and it certainly wasn't reading Shakespeare. It was most likely watching cartoons on Saturday mornings and old swashbuckler movies in the afternoon. Definitely not Shakespeare. Originally, Galton was going to be a medical doctor, and he started training at Birmingham General Hospital at 16. Medicine in Galton's day was extremely messy, nasty, and evil. There was no anesthetic yet. Surgeries were awful and bloody and kind of horrible things. In fact, it turned his cousin Charles Darwin off of medicine totally. Now, Galton, being very systematic and being one of those people that thought deeply about things, wanted to understand the effects of drugs that he would be administering to his patients. So he obtained the equivalent of our modern physician's desk reference book and started taking a small dose of each of the drugs, and he was going to work through them from A to Z. Well, he came up with something called croton oil when he got to the C's. Croton oil is a purgative. In other words, it makes you vomit everything out of your stomach. And Galton wisely discontinued his drug experiments at that time. Eventually, he moved to King's College in London and was granted a degree in Cambridge in 1843. After finishing his education, Galton did something similar to his cousin Charles. It was a thing that bright, rich college graduates did at the time. They did a grand tour. And instead of going to sea, Galton traveled to Africa and the Mideast. When he came back, he constructed maps of previously unknown regions and wrote travel guides about his experience that were very popular at the time. Guess you could say he was an early Rick Steves for those of you who are fans of public television. The other thing that, no, I missed a slide here. Galton, sorry. What? Slides are screwed up, sorry. Definitely don't have that 240 IQ. What can you say? Galton is known primarily as someone who measured stuff. Galton just loved to measure anything he could get his hands on. He measured the maps carefully in the Mideast and Africa. And over his lifetime, he studied a wide variety of topics that do exemplify how much of a polymath he was. He was the person who invented the weather map and figured out, came up with some systematic ways of putting in highs and lows, barometric pressure, wind, and things like that. So here is one of his early weather maps for the British Isles in March of 1875. He also was one of the first people to do composite faces and put groups of people together using camera techniques at the time with the eyes as the primary focus, kind of morphed together multiple pictures and images to create composite people. Now, he was very interested in criminal behavior, and he tried to make facial composites of people who had committed different crimes. Here is a series of composite pictures of larcenists, people who had committed petty crimes. And you can see that 5 pictures are averaged in the first, 7 in the second, 4 in the third, and 2 in the one on the right. And what Galton was trying to see was, is there a certain kind of face that a criminal would have? It's an interesting idea, but it didn't work very well. Now, this work, incidentally, has been carried on in a different way by Dr. Judy Langlois at the University of Texas, Austin. And Langlois has made composites of faces and put them together and averaged them, and she's found some fascinating things. Not with criminal behavior or mental illness as Galton had tried to do, but Langlois had found that the most averaged face is the most beautiful face, the most physically attractive face for women. And she's created different composites of multiple faces, and the interesting thing is, if you take the average of 64 different women and do several of those averages with all different women, the faces almost look identical. So Galton pioneered composite faces for study in psychology, which later became something that made an interesting contribution to the field. He attempted to study the efficacy of prayer. He had people pray for other people and examined whether it made their lives better. And unfortunately, he didn't find an effect for that. He attempted to determine which country had the most beautiful women. Now, part of the criticism of Darwin's work was that he was very ethnocentric, which was very common for people at the time. Doesn't make it right, but as you would imagine, if you're going to study cross-national beauty, and to see which country had the most beautiful women. Biases can easily steer the results, as they did with Galton, who found that English women were the most beautiful women in the world. He also measured boredom at scientific lectures to see what the effect of disinterest had on learning. But I missed a slide back here because they kind of got messed up on me. One of the other things that I found fascinating that Galton studied was fingerprints. And Galton was the first person to suggest to Scotland Yard, which is the headquarters for the British National Police, that they use fingerprints to identify criminal behavior. And Galton came up with a systematic means of measuring fingerprints and using them for identification. So you have fingerprints, weather maps, facial composites, prayer, beauty. Galton was all over the place. If you could measure it, Galton was interested in assessing it. Galton is most famous for his work in the study and measurement of intelligence. Now, Galton believed that intelligence was a matter of what he called sensory acuity. Sensory acuity basically has to do with the speed of processing of the different senses. And he believed it was a natural endowment, something that we all were born with at different levels. The other thing that he posited, and he was one of the first people to scientifically develop this idea, and that's the notion that intelligence is heritable, which is something that still holds up. We know that intelligence is highly heritable. Probably about 70% of the variance or variation in intelligence scores is due to genetic influences. Galton couldn't have known that at the time because we didn't know about genetics back then. Galton's most famous work is Hereditary Genius. And Hereditary Genius was his attempt to demonstrate that intelligence is heritable. He studied the offspring of highly placed English males. Now you have to remember Zeitgeist stuff, spirit of the time stuff. Galton did this work when women basically were not in the workplace. And if you were going to become rich and famous, basically it was because you came from a long line of individuals who were also rich and famous. And Galton made the point that the offspring of what he called illustrious individuals were far more likely to be illustrious than those offspring of non-illustrious individuals. In other words, intelligent people have intelligent children, and people who aren't intellectually endowed have children who aren't intellectually endowed. And he did this by looking at strata of English society. He looked at individuals who were famous military leaders, politicians, clergymen, folks like that. He went back in their family trees and found that individuals that were eminent in their current time came from a long line, of ancestors going back in time who were also extremely eminent. But he found out one thing that's probably the most important thing about intelligence and genius, and it still holds to this day, and I love his way he's twisted the phrase for this. You can be really intelligent, but Galton demonstrated that you also need zeal and vigor. We would now call that motivation to obtain eminence. It's not enough to be smart. You have to be motivated to do things you have to have the energy to do things. We probably all know individuals who are really bright but don't apply themselves. They don't have Galton's zeal and vigor, and hence they don't accomplish their potential. Galton also developed an idea that has a horrible twist, although it's a basic, simple idea and it would work. And it's the idea of eugenics. And Galton believed that humans should be paired together by desirable characteristics, like intelligence, and then should be subsidized by the government for getting married and being together. So this came on the heels of the introduction of Darwin's Origin of Species book. And Origin of Species highly influenced Galton's thinking. And he developed the idea that if you could selectively breed plants and animals for certain characteristics, why can't you selectively breed people for certain characteristics as well? Now, this is possible. The Germans tried it during World War II. Not only did they commit the Holocaust and did the evil things of killing millions and millions of people, but they tried to pair together what they thought were perfect little male and female Nazis to have children and have them populate what Hitler speculated as his 1,000-year Reich. I think Galton, even though he had the ethnocentricities and racism of his time and his class in Victorian England, would have been horrified that his ideas were adopted by the Nazis and used as justification for killing millions and millions of people. But you could probably do this, selectively breed people for human characteristics. The problem is, who's the one that selects those characteristics? And what are the ethics and morals? And we just don't do this. For better or worse, we don't try to match people up for intelligence and have them get married, nor do we try to tell people from the lower social stratas and the less intelligent folks that you cannot have children. This wasn't always the case because there were some eugenics thinkers who, even until the 1960s in southern United States, were using eugenics ideas to sterilize poor black women with mental deficiencies so they wouldn't have children. In fact, the lawsuits on those cases rolled through and weren't completely settled until the early 1990s. Now, Galton also developed some of the first psychology questionnaires. And he studied scientists, and in 1874 he publishes English Men of Science, Their Nature and Nurture. And he again discusses the notion that there's potential for high intelligence is inherited, but it must be nurtured by the proper environment. And we still do this. We try to develop social programs to give children who are disadvantaged a step up and a fair playing ground. We have programs like Head Start, other programs that subsidize mothers and children from impoverished backgrounds so that they have a better environment that can nurture their intelligence. Galton also studied the differences between dizygotic fraternal twins and monozygotic identical twins, and made the discovery that dizygotic twins were very dissimilar to each other even when raised together. Modern findings in twin studies in behavior genetics continue to support this basic finding. He developed a word association test that was later adopted by Carl Jung, and other people looked at it. Supposedly Freud looked at it but never used it. He wrote 75 words on separate pieces of paper, and then he had individuals sort these out, put things together that were similar or different to them, and found out some interesting things. Oh, and that slide skipped, sorry. Mouse is a bit too sensitive. Galton found 3 things from his word association test. First of all, he found responses were relatively consistent. And this is a finding that later shows up in personality psychology. Furthermore, he found that the responses individuals made to the associations were often drawn from their childhood experiences. And Galton's word association test basically was one of the first tests to be able to get at different aspects of the mind that had not been explored before. One of my favorite things, I know I'm saying that frequently with Galton, I'm kind of a Galton fan, is that he began something called an anthropometry laboratory. First at London's International Health Exhibit in 1884. Later the exhibit was moved to South Kensington, which is on the southern tip of England, and was there for several years. Basically, this was an area about 35 feet long. It was open for the public to see. You went through and filled out a card, and then Galton's research assistants measured you in a variety of different ways. Height, weight, cognitive speed of processing. One thing that people like to always write about is he had a strength of blow test. Now, if you're about to blow some air at my computer screen here, that's not the kind of blow he was talking about. He had a wooden rod attached to a disc of wood which had a pillow attached to it. And he had a spring-loaded device with this thing. There was a spring on it. It's kind of like the carnival hit the lever and see if you can ring the bell kind of thing. You'd hit the shaft and it would push back far to a certain point, and it was an index of strength. Incidentally, this is one of the things that kept on getting broken and had to be constantly repaired by Darwin's research assistants. So, almost 10,000 people a year went through one of the 2 forms of the lab, either at the health exhibition in London or at South Kensington. And as I said, they were measured in terms of their physical characteristics, their reaction times, sensory acuity, stuff like that. And then the individuals paid Galton a small fee to participate in the study, and they received as a souvenir of their participation a copy of their results. Now you could go back through Galton's lab a second time for a reduced fee, and they would measure you and assess you again. It's kind of getting retest data. This data was an extremely large data set and actually didn't get fully exploited in Galton's time. It wasn't until the 1960s and 70s when computers started to be used for statistics that individuals continued to work on the facts and figures in the anthropomorphic laboratory. It's kind of my dream data collection process. You give all of your participants all of the tests and measures you want them to take, and then instead of you paying them or giving them credit for participating, they pay you. And then if they come back again, they pay you again and give you more data. Sounds like a great way to do research. Galton found this, I already mentioned test-retest data. One of the other things that Galton did, being an individual who was obsessed with measuring things, he was interested in the relationships between variables. And he developed something called a correlation statistic. And this was the first brush at a correlation coefficient. Galton had noticed that as one variable increases for a person, oftentimes the other variable increases in a systematic way as well. He formed a basic calculation for correlations, and his student and biographer Karl Pearson refined that statistic, and you probably know it from your psychology statistics class, the Pearson product moment correlation. And Galton also was influential in determining the calculations of other basic stat concepts that we still use today, including the standard deviation. And basically he showed, as I've just discussed, variables have the tendency to covary. Now, just in terms of Galton stuff, we know that there is generally a correlation between height and shoe size. It's not a perfect correlation, but it's a pretty strong correlation. Generally, the taller an individual is, the bigger feet they have. If you think about Shaquille O'Neal's got monstrous sized feet, but he's also extremely tall. If Shaq had size 10s, he probably couldn't stand up straight and probably would just keel over from the lack of balance. He also discovered the concept of regression to the mean, the idea that individuals may score extremely high or low on one occasion, but over multiple occasions perform more at their mean level. So your highs and your lows kind of wash out. You might have a really, really good day, but then you have an average day following that. And you might have a bad day in the future, but then you have an average or a good day, and it kind of evens out. And your scores regress towards the mean. And that happens for populations too, and groups, not just individuals. In this unit, we've looked at some of the founding theorists in terms of developing theories of intelligence. In the other videos in this unit, you're going to be looking at Alfred Binet's work. He's actually the first person to start developing intellectual tests, but he has his own video. You're going to also be looking at the work of Howard Gardner, who gives us a modern view of intelligence, which goes beyond quantitative and verbal abilities, as well as a few other tidbits as we go through. So hopefully you'll find this unit interesting. Bye now. This has been a We Have Couches video productions. Copyright 2020, Professor Michael Botwin. Go think about it. Bye now.